Okay, in terms of the stuff, welcome to the second episode of Introduction to Philosophy. Roles going around. If you weren't here last time, or if you were here last time, be sure to initial by your name, so you can put you down as attending, lift any attendance holes if you're existing, so you can get that financial aid, etc., etc. In terms of the upcoming deadlines, unchanged. So the most close ones are quizzes for part 1, deadline September 21st, the end of the day. You can do the quizzes anytime you want, all of them available. Just be sure to complete all of the quizzes for part 1, and there's several of them by this date. And then for exam 1, covering part 1, that is due September 21st, but in terms of the deadline, when it's all available, that's October 19th. So the closest upcoming deadlines are, be sure to complete quizzes part 1 by September 21st, and exam 1, covering part 1, October 19th. Before pressing on to the new stuff, before pressing on to the new stuff, any stuff about the stuff that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we're looking at the question of what is philosophy, and we saw the basic definition is, of course, coming from Philo, which means love. And of course, Sophia meaning wisdom. And of course, we get our city, Philadelphia, which again probably means a love of cheesesteaks or something along those lines. Now, as we saw, we're looking at the various questions and problems that philosophy deals with and how it is similar to but different from science and religion. And here's the basic idea. Philosophy and science and religion are all trying to answer the big questions about life, the universe, and everything. And they have, in many cases, similar, questions, like what is real? What is reality like? What is the ultimate nature of things? But of course, they have differences. Otherwise, we just have one instead of 3. Now, in the case of science, it uses, at least in theory, the scientific method, logic, reasoning, and so forth. And the idea is to show how things work. And one key thing about science is that science is value neutral. It doesn't tell us what is good, what is bad, how we should live our lives. It simply tells us what is. So all scientific questions are questions about what is, what there is. And again, it relies primarily on logic, reasoning, scientific method. Religion, of course, also deals with big questions. But unlike science, it goes beyond just saying what there is. And religion tries to tell us what there is. Is there a God? Are there many gods? Are there angels? Are there demons? Is there reincarnation? Is there heaven? Is there hell? Etc. But it also tries to tell us what to do or not do. Lots of thou shalls and thou shalt not. Now, religion does use reason, logic, etc. And so it does have kind of that overlap a bit with science. But of course, religion doesn't always rely on just pure reason, because you can have faith, you can have mystical experiences, you can have divine inspiration. And so one main difference between philosophy, or between religion and science is, the thou shalt and shall not, and of course the ways you can know things. So in science, you're not allowed to say, God revealed to me how superstrings work, but in religion you can talk about God revealing things. So how does philosophy fit in here? Well, philosophy is like science in the way that it is, at least in the West, all about reasoning and logic. So everything has to be proven. You can't take stuff just on faith, except when you can, as we'll see later. But also, similar to religion, philosophy is not about just what there is, but also what you should and should not do. So philosophy does include elements of, in ethics, you should or should not. So that's how they're similar, and a bit about how they're different. All deal with the big questions, but they differ a bit in methodology. So then, what is it we do when we do philosophy? Well, as I mentioned, We can look at philosophy in terms of the questions it asks, as well as the problems it tries to solve. So without further ado, let us see that. Now, as I mentioned last time, philosophy, like any other academic field, is not simply monolithic. It's not just like philosophy. Just like if you took a class in chemistry, you wouldn't learn just chemistry. You may learn organic chemistry. Or if you took a class in biology, you wouldn't just learn like all the biology. You would learn particular types, like cellular biology. Or if you take a class in history, you don't just learn like history, you learn particular history, like 12th century European, for example. And philosophy breaks down in similar ways by subject. And in alphabetical order, not in order of importance, here are some of the main branches, categories, fields of philosophy, which also can be the names of many philosophy classes. So first, alphabetically, aesthetics. Definition: this is the branch of philosophy that deals with theories of art and beauty, but also, I suppose, ugliness as well. Now, there are many problems there, and many questions. The biggest one, of course, when it comes to art, is probably, well, what are questions people have about art, like the biggest question? Well, when someone goes to like a museum and sees like some weird painting or statue, they often say, is that really art? Yeah, so one basic question is, what is art? So if you're, imagine you get hired by God to sort out everything in the universe. And God says, okay, I need two piles here. I need a pile of art, and I need all the non-art in that pile. And so the question would be, what rules, what standards or definition would you use to take something and say art, or say not art? And since the time people have been peopling, we have been working on trying to define that. And it's actually pretty tough. People often say they know art when they see it, but of course coming up with a strict set of standards. What is it to be art? If you get this, you're art. If you don't get it, you're not art. What are the standards? And it's, again, surprisingly difficult. Now, of course, a fair question about anything in philosophy or anything in general is, why would that matter? Why should it matter whether something is art or not? And one reason is very practical, namely money. Because if something is truly great art, how much money are you supposed to be paying for it? Like how much, suppose you found a Picasso or a Rembrandt or a Pollock, like in your attic, real one. Could you retire, like tomorrow? Yeah, because it'd be worth millions of dollars. And even work that's relatively new, people pay, like if you get on to even small art shows, like here, FSU has art gallery, and they have, sketches, $15,000. And so if you're going to pay a lot of money for something, you'd probably want to know, is that actually art or not? And so one practical thing is in defining art would be the money. So if a school is going to spend a lot of money on a statue or an object, if you're buying art, you want to know, am I actually getting art? A second thing, of course, is also kind of practical, but also kind of political. If you look at human history, even recently, art is considered something important. So if what one group of people do, or a particular thing that people do, is excluded, that's a way of saying that people, that culture, that practice is not important. So for example, graffiti used to be regarded as merely criminal, not seen as art. Certain types of music, if you go through the history of music, when new music comes in, jazz, rock and roll, hip hop and all its variations, people will say that's not music, it's noise. Which is more than just saying, they don't like it, it's saying this doesn't matter. this is not art, this is not worthy. And so there are important cultural battles over the worth of a culture, the worth of even a people about the art. So even something as theoretical as what is art can be very important in terms of money and in terms of cultural status, acceptance, and value. Now, of course, there are many other questions as well. Once you're going back to our example, if you're hired by God to divide the universe into art and non-art, the next question, of course, is splitting the art from, good to bad. And so another big question or problem is, what is it that makes art good? And of course, the practical concern there as well. For example, movies are kind of expensive these days, especially if you go to like the 3D IMAX, HD, gluten-free, free-range, organic movies. And you don't want to spend your money unless the movie is going to be pretty good. So how do you tell if the movie is going to be good? You look at the trailers, but of course, and look at the reviews. Of course, the trailers are designed to make you go. So they can have movies with awesome trailers, and the movie is like, I go back and watch the trailers again. And reviews, of course, can be wrong, but it's a good place to look. And so when you try to assess, is it good, we hopefully use some sort of standards. So if you go to Rotten Tomatoes and look at a review, you're hoping the reviewer is using some kind of standards, hopefully ones you agree with, so you can say, okay, they say it's like good, so I can risk putting down my money and my time to watch it. And then there's all kinds of other, literally endless questions, like questions about particular genres, like what makes something, say, magical realism as opposed to just pure fantasy. For example, movies like Birdman, I Killed Giants, those are what are called magical realism. There are others that are just pure fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, and so people get into genres and fight about that. And same with music. Where does the particular song, where does it belong? Then there are also questions that spread into other areas. For example, issues of censorship, issues of ethics about art. So for example, think of like recent cases, the Me Too movement, where you had famous people in like Kevin Spacey, for example, and various producers like Harvey Weinstein, and it raises a question about art and ethics. If you have an artist, an actor, who's a terrible person, engaging in assault and harassment, should that affect your judgment of their work? So for example, do the revelations about Kevin Spacey, does that mean that we shouldn't watch his movies anymore? That the Netflix series House of Cards, you shouldn't go back and look at that because you're looking at a very bad person who's done bad things? Or is the art totally separate, where you could say, well, Kevin Spacey's a terrible person, but House of Cards or his movies he did are still good movies. And same with other artists, like authors. Suppose you have someone who's a brilliant writer, but they're a terrible person. Does that mean we shouldn't read their books? So, all kinds of stuff going on in aesthetics, and when we get to part 4, we'll see just a bit more of aesthetics. So kind of main thing here is definition, branch of philosophy dealing with art and beauty. Some core problems, and in terms of generally recognize them, it's stuff dealing with art and beauty, like what is art, what is good art, what is beauty objective or subjective, that type of stuff. Before heading into epistemology, anything about aesthetics that needs more art or beauty? Epistemology. Like aesthetics, entire class on it, offered probably this spring, and this is terms of the definition. Like most of these terms, it comes from the Greek. Ology, of course, in Greek means study of, science of, theory of, and episteme means knowledge. So epistemology is the study, of knowledge, or theory of knowledge. Now, back in the ancient days when I was an undergrad and grad school, epistemology was kind of a weird and, to be honest, kind of boring part of philosophy. And it got like super boring in the 70s, 80s, and until the 90s, then it got interesting. Because most of it was pretty theoretical stuff, like under what conditions do you know? And epistemologists spend countless hours writing tedious papers about how you could be fooled by, like, cardboard cutouts and not know, and it was terrible. But then along came a movie in 1999, The Matrix, which made epistemology pretty interesting. And of course, if you've seen the classic movie The Matrix, it addresses the basic question of epistemology, the basic problem, which is this. Probably the big problem in this field is what's called the problem of the external world, which is, how do you know what's happening now is real, that you're not dreaming, or rather a nightmare, that you're not in a virtual reality, a very sad one, or maybe you're being deceived by like an evil demon, or hallucinating, or whatever particular story you might like. And of course, The Matrix, brought that to the big screen. The question is, are you really in a physical world, or are you in the Matrix, where this is just, you're not seeing people or desks or chairs, it's all like a really bad video game, where this is all zeros and ones. And of course, the problem is, how do you know? Now, of course, in the movie, they put in things like, there'd be like a glitch or something, and of course, Neo gets pulled out of the Matrix. But even if you think you've been pulled out of the Matrix, how do you know this is really real? Now, this is one of these problems where, on one hand, you could say it really doesn't matter. Because suppose you found out, suppose like suddenly something appears and says, yeah, you're all in the Matrix. See you later. Well, what would that change? Could you stop eating? Stop working? No, because you just die. Maybe die virtually, but that'd still be dead. And so on one hand, you could say it really doesn't matter, because unless you could escape from the fake world, it doesn't really matter. So on one hand, you could say it's a problem that really isn't serious, because what difference would it make? On the other hand, though, it is still kind of an important problem, because if you can't even know that this is real, then how can you be certain about anything? And the answer is, you can't. Now, on one side, that's terrifying. Nothing is certain, nothing can be known, there's no guarantees. On the other hand, it's kind of a useful view, because if you realize that even something as seemingly obvious as this being real can be doubted, can be questioned, then you realize you can doubt anything. And so everything is up for consideration, which is basically the beginning of learning stuff. The ability to say, maybe what I'm being told by these people, who may be terrible people, maybe it's not true. Because freedom begins with doubt. Now, a smaller problem is what's called the problem of other minds. And the problem is, again, kind of theoretical. When you see other people, can you, like Bill Clinton, can you feel their pain? Can you think their thoughts? Do you know what's going on behind their eyes? Can you look at someone and say, I know exactly what they're thinking, I know exactly what they're feeling, I can never be deceived by anybody? No, we don't know what other people are thinking. We don't even know if there are other people. If you've seen sci-fi movies, horror movies, what seems to be a person or a human may not be a human at all. Movies like The Thing, etc. Or today's, robot technology. Maybe Google is way more advanced than we think, and somebody in the room is not a human, but a Google bot gathering information to sell us more crap. How would you tell? Well, I mean, you could say, well, if you cut someone open, but no, don't do that. But you really can't tell. So, on a theoretical level, it's a problem. How do you know other things have minds? Now, it also has practical implications. First, think about things like artificial intelligence, what you're working towards are things like Amazon Echo, Alexa, Siri, etc. And so one practical problem here is, how would you know when Alexa or Siri became conscious, was thinking, and not just, empty code? Now, even more practically, getting down to some real practical application, how do you know when someone else tells you something, like trust me or they love you, how do you know they're not BSing you? How do you know when someone says the words I love you, that they're really thinking, I'm playing this chump, I'm going to take him or her for everything she's got? How do you know? And the answer is, until you're played, you do not know. I'm not encouraging people to be suspicious of people, but it's an example of practical epistemology. It's as practical as looking at someone else and saying, is this person telling me the truth or not? And the problem with the minds is you never know for sure, because you don't know what's going on behind your eyes. We guess, we hope, but unless you have telepathy or something, you never know. So epistemology, again, it's kind of started off as kind of like, how do you know stuff? But it has some pretty interesting problems, which gave rise to movies like The Matrix, The Problem of the Minds, movies like Ex Machina, The Terminator, etc. So, useful stuff. And we'll see in part 3 some epistemology. All right. And there's also, again, in the spring, an entire class devoted to it if you can't get enough epistemology, or just need 3 more credit hours. Before moving away from epistemology, is there anything about this that needs more stuff? Ethics, or morality. Ethics is all about what? When you're talking about ethics, you're talking about
moral right and wrong.
Yeah, morality. Right, wrong, good and evil, all that stuff. Now, philosophy, of course, complicates stuff. So when you look at morality and ethics, we don't just talk about morality, we gotta talk about different types and different levels. Now, one type of morality is what's called descriptive morality. This is what sociology, anthropology, history does, where they say, this is the values of this people at this time. So if somebody says that, say, American moral views about equality in the 1950s were this, they're not, judging or doing philosophy, they're doing descriptive ethics. They're doing sociology, anthropology, history. Just saying, these people this time believe this about good and bad. Now, that's where the philosophy of ethics and morality begins, unless you just totally make stuff up. But if we just stop there, we'd be doing history, sociology, anthropology, psychology, just saying these people think this about good and evil. So how do we transition into morality and ethics philosophically? Well, it goes beyond just saying these people think this about good and evil. We also want to say what is truly, if anything, good, evil, right, or wrong. Now, to deal with this, philosophers over the eons have broken ethics into 3 levels of abstraction. The highest level, metaethics, meaning above or beyond, is the most theoretical, most abstract, the least concrete. This deals with the big, sweeping questions. Questions like, what is good? What is evil? Not particular things, not is, adultery itself wrong, but what is evil itself? Is evil, like in some movies and video games, is it a power and force in the universe that can corrupt and infect things? Or is good a real thing that, like in some video games and movies, can imbue things and make them, good? Or is good and evil just kind of how we feel about stuff? Just saying, is it just how we feel about stuff? So when someone says, that's good, do they just mean, I like it? Or if they say, that's evil, do they just mean, don't like it? So those are some of the meta questions, what is good, what is evil? And then another one is about the basis of good and evil. So if we say that is good, what does that mean? And what is the foundation of it? Some people believe that God sets good and evil. Other people believe good and evil is based on, say, how much happiness or unhappiness it creates. Like our good dead friend John Stuart Mill, that we'll see in part 4. Now moving down away from the most abstract, normative ethics deals with building principles, rules, standards by which you do ethics. So the meta-ethics, again, is the most theoretical. Questions like, what is good itself? What is evil itself? Normative level deals with, it's still kind of broad, but closer to Earth. Again, this is where you build particular standards. For example, if someone has like a moral, we'll take as a concrete example, 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments, stealing, is that okay? Adultery? Okay. So those would be, broad rules and principles. And so at the normative level, that's laying out the rules and principles. Now the most concrete level is the applied level. That's where you take standards, rules, principles, and theories, and shockingly enough, apply them. So if you have a question like, would, say, a particular lie be wrong? Would, say, a particular action? Take, for example, recently ICE was separating, families. And so an example of applied ethics would be, is it morally acceptable to separate families in that manner? Other examples, more particular ones, are things like, is the use of, say, drones to track people morally acceptable? Is the use of our, technology, like our cell phones, et cetera, to track us, acceptable? Is capital punishment acceptable? And so this would be what we normally think of when we think of ethics. Is doing this particular thing right or wrong? So ethics, obviously chock full of all kinds of problems and questions. So anything that deals with good and evil, right and wrong, falls under ethics. There's not surprisingly, an ethics course offered coming up in the spring. And so if you want to see more ethics, there's an entire course devoted to it. Before moving away from ethics into logic, anything about good, evil, it needs more stuff. Oh, the applied ethics is when we take our standards, rules, principles, and then we use them to decide if particular things or actions are good or bad themselves. So meta is the most theoretical example. What is good? What is evil? Normative level, more concrete, dealing with questions of standards and principles would be a question like, is in general killing right or wrong? Is in general lying right or wrong? And then applied ethics would be, it's the type of thing you typically see in like essays that are written. So one question might be, is separating, migrant families, is that morally acceptable or not? Is charging students, interest and not allowing them to discharge student loans and bankruptcies, is that morally acceptable or not? Oh, it is a warning. Congress is probably up to something with student loans, so probably keep an eye on that, because they're always trying to screw, they're always trying to screw students over in that regard. Because one thing is if you have bankruptcy, which hopefully no longer have, your student loans don't go away. government always tries to get that money. I don't know that personally, have not gone bankrupt. But all, all kinds of stuff going on. Apparently they're rolling back a lot of the legislation, so keep an eye on your student loans if you're taking them, because they're trying to do bad things. From the standpoint of, your standpoint. Which is a moral question. Is that a bad thing? Trying to screw students over to make money. Okay, logic. Logic deals with assessing arguments, philosophical arguments, not just like fights about stuff. Now, logic is, not surprisingly, kind of the brain and nervous system of philosophy. What makes philosophy differ from just like BSing about stuff is the logic part, where you have to prove things and argue for things. Now, as you might imagine, logic is a key part of science as well, because you get the scientific method is basically a special subcategory of logic. Now, logic comes in a surprising amount of varieties. If you've had critical inquiry, you've seen deductive logic, inductive logic, in particular types like categorical logic, truth functional logic, and there are various other types as well, like deontological logic, etc. Questions? Some are very nuts and bolts questions, like what is a good argument, or what is a premise, what is a conclusion. Others are more theoretical, like does logic match reality, or does reality have a logic to it? To use kind of an analogy, is reality like a video game or a computer program where behind what we're seeing is mathematics and code and logic, kind of a matrix view of things? Or maybe reality just seems to have a logic, but it really doesn't. Stuff happens for no reason. Now, not surprisingly, there's an entire course called Logic, which hopefully will be offered in the spring. So if you need logic or are interested in logic, whole class devoted to that. Before moving away from logic, any stuff about the stuff that needs stuff. Metaphysics. Perhaps the strangest branch of philosophy. This deals with the study of the nature and structure of reality. So epistemology is a question of what do you know, how do you know? And metaphysics is the question, what is there? What is really real for real? Now, one sub-branch of metaphysics is what's called ontology, which comes from the Greek ontos, meaning thing, but which I always translate in my head as stuff, because I like the word stuff. And so ontology is a study of what there is. Not in terms of like studying backpacks or bottles or kiwis, both the bird and the fruit, but in terms of metaphysical kinds. So if someone is wondering, are there angels and devils and souls, they're doing ontology. They're wondering what is really real for real. Now the term metaphysics came about in a way kind of by accident. Back in the, so the story goes, way back in the day, someone was putting together a collection of Aristotle's works. And Aristotle wrote a lot of books. And one of his books was called The Physics. And there was a book after the Physics, and the person putting together this collection said, let's call that the book after physics, namely Metaphysics. So strictly speaking, it means after physics. So it just happened to be where it was. I guess if Aristotle had written a cooking book, then we would be calling this meta-cooking, which would be weird, but that's pretty weird. So what are some problems and questions in metaphysics? Well, one of the big ones that just concern people, sensitive people, is there a divine entity or entities? Put simply, are there gods or a god in existence? And people have been wondering about that since the beginning. And that's kind of like one of our basic metaphysical questions. we also wonder about ourselves. Namely, do we have a spirit, mind, and soul in addition to the physical body, or are we just physical entities? Now, there are many classic problems in metaphysics. One we'll look at is what's called the problem of universals. We'll look at this. Plato pretty much got it rolling, but it's the question of, in virtue of what are individuals members of types? So, we're all humans, and the question would be, in virtue of what am I human, in virtue of what are you human? You know, what is the metaphysical explanation? As we'll see, Plato thinks the answer is the forms. And we'll see how crazy that is. Now this also, despite being kind of a very theoretical problem, does have some practical implications. For example, we categorize things all the time. We divide people and things into categories, often to do terrible things. So one question that falls on the problem of universals, since it's about categories, would be questions about gender. Is gender a natural category such that people are born into it and you are that, or is it a social construct that we build? Similarly with race. Racists, what makes them in part racist, in addition to being terrible people, is the view that race is metaphysically or biologically real. It's a real thing. And as we've seen with the history of sexism and racism, that view does have serious implications. Even though at the abstract level, it's basically a philosophical question. Are these categories real? But then of course people can do very terrible, terrible things. Another problem in philosophy, which we'll look at as well, is the problem of personal identity. Part of it is the problem of being what it is to be a person. Because we're people, and things like the water bottle and backpack are not. And one of the good things of being a person is that if you're a person, other people generally are more reluctant to do bad stuff to you. Not always. So if I took this backpack and threw it around on the floor, you'd probably think, wow, that's really crazy and stupid. But you probably wouldn't think it was wrong. But if someone takes a person and throws them around and hurts them, we tend to think that's wrong because that's a person. The issue, moral debates about abortion, euthanasia, they often center around being a person. Is that entity, that fetus, a person or not? When someone has, when they're injured or damaged enough to be in a persistent vegetative state, are they still a person? Or is the person gone and all that's left is the body? Now, it's also a very important practical question, in addition to the moral concerns, namely, what happens after death depends on what it is to be a person. Because if a person is just their body, well, when their body dies, what happens to them? It's done. It's gone. But if a person is their soul, that could keep on going. Another kind of sci-fi example is there are companies now that are working to back up people. Now, when you have an important document, picture, movie, etc., Excel spreadsheet, and you don't want to lose it, what do? Yeah, you save it, ideally in multiple places. Back in the ancient days, people would back it up on a floppy drive or print a copy. But today, of course, you can put it on various cloud services, Dropbox, Google, etc. And the idea is if you have your laptop and someone happens your laptop, it's still backed up on the cloud until the cloud gets destroyed. Spoiler. Now, wouldn't it be handy if you could back yourself up? So that way if something happens to you, shark attack, squirrel attack, zombie apocalypse, zombie squirrel apocalypse, zombie shark, squirrel apocalypse, all kinds of options, that you could just, reboot with a new body. Be like, whew, that was exciting. Like in video games. In most video games, separate, crushingly punishing ones, you just come back. You get a save game or you just respawn. It'd be super handy to be able to respawn. Be like, I think I can make it across the road. Guess I didn't. I respawned. Okay, start over. Do that one again. Now, what they're trying to do, of course, is find a way to back us up. Now, one very important question when they finally claim to do that would be, does that actually work? Because if the entity that they produce, because kind of the plan is this, they back up your contents of your mind, which is supposed to be you. That way when your body dies, you can keep going, like in a computer or a new body. Episode of Black Mirror there's one like that, where they reconstruct a person. Now, of course, the practical concern here would be, is that really you back walking around, or is it just something that thinks it's you, pretending to be you that's not you? And the reason why that matters is because if it's not you, you're dead. You wasted all that money. If it is you, then great, money well spent, potentially. Now, it's not a real thing yet. Unless Google's got some stuff that I'm talking about, which may be true. But they're planning on trying to make it a real thing. And what it is to be a person, that's at the core of the matter, whether it's worth doing or not. Because if you don't save if it's not preserving you, you're just paying to have somebody who thinks they're you walk around, wearing your clothes, living in your house, eating your food. So all kinds of questions and problems in metaphysics. And as you might imagine by now, there's an entire class. In fact, the class after this one is metaphysics, entire course devoted to that. Before getting to social philosophy, anything about metaphysics that needs more meta or physics? Social philosophy. Not surprisingly, this includes all the philosophies of all the social stuff. So, philosophy of law, political philosophy, etc. Now, this area has many very theoretical problems, as you imagine, but also many very practical problems. So, what are some examples? Well, one classic one is the question or problem of authority. Now, every April 15th, the government demands of you what? Yeah, tribute in the form of taxes. Now, if someone just came by and said, hey, give me a bunch of money, you'd probably say, no. Let's say they have a gun or something. And of course, the state has lots of guns. But a good question is, why do we owe the state, giving them that money? The state tells us lots of things we can't do. It tells us what we can buy, who we can marry, how fast we can drive, what we can drive, what movies we can see. Every aspect of our life is controlled in some degree by the state. And a rather important question is, what gives them the right? I mean, yeah, they have people with guns, police and military, go around and shoot people, but we'd kind of like to think it's more than do it or somebody's going to show up and shoot you. Or maybe that's all there is to it, do it or someone shows up to shoot you. Now, in Western democracies, our story of authority is what? Why do people have to listen to Trump? Why can't you just dismiss him as a, some reality show buffoon who's tweeting false things? Why do people have to listen to him? Because he's the president. And that came about because election. In the election, he won the Electoral College. Those are the rules. So, in the United States, our theory of justification is, majority, well, not majority rule, but Electoral College rule. That you have a democracy. You have a vote. We agree we'll abide by the election. So, same reason Trump is president because voted. We agreed to the system. Andrew Gillum is running for governor now. Why? Because we agreed to a system of voting. And we voted, and he won. And so, and if whoever's elected, governor will be governor because we vote for them. Yeah, and so our justification is because we agree, which seems like a okay justification. Other problems, another classic one is the problem of liberty, which is, the matter of freedom. What kind of freedom should we have? Now this ties, of course, into the state, because the state is always telling us what we can and cannot do about just about everything. Every aspect of your life, the state gets into. And so the question is how much should the state be getting into our business? Now, one view that we'll look at is the state should be in every aspect of your business completely. It's called totalitarianism, which is the state runs everything. Now, the other extreme is what's called anarchism, in which there is no state at all. And in between, there's like what we've got. The state is quite a bit in our life, the regulations for everything. But we're not at totalitarianism. And so there are important questions about what kind of things should we be free to do? And how free should we be? Take, for example, one near and dear to the hearts of many Americans, namely guns. So should people be allowed to own their own personal tactical nukes?
No.
Why not? That'd be cool. 4th of July, boom, nuke. No, because, probably a little too dangerous. I think the NRA, even they don't that personal nukes. Then it becomes, of course, a more serious matter when you start talking about things like assault weapons. And people running for office have proposed assault weapon bans, bullet taxes, which of course are restrictions on liberty. If there's an assault weapon ban, you can't buy an assault weapon. Now, you may not be concerned about that particular liberty, but everyone has some liberties they're concerned about. Things that they would want to buy, that other people may not want them to buy. And it may not be a gun, it may be a book, or it may be music, or it may be anything. Because for anything that's out there, there's somebody out there who hates that other people have it, and they really would like to stop having that. Be it a book, or a movie, or an idea. So next time, we'll pick up on the next slide with more stuff. So, see you then.